Well, welcome everybody. My name is Beth Folsom. I'm the program manager here at History Cambridge. And before we begin our program, I want to acknowledge that our headquarters, the Hooper Lee Nichols House, sits on the traditional land of the Massachusetts people. So welcome to our final History Cafe program of the year. And I'd like to start by asking any of you who weren't here just a minute ago to go ahead and identify yourselves in the chat and tell us where you are joining us from. And a reminder that you can use the chat box to ask questions throughout the program. History Cambridge would like to thank the Bridge Street Fund, which is a special initiative of Mass Humanities, for their generous support of tonight's program. And I'd like to extend a special thank you and welcome to the Friends of History Cambridge who have made tonight's event possible. If you want to consider joining our group, head over to our website, historycambridge.org, and click on the support button at the top of the page. You can also sign up there to receive our e-news so you don't miss out on great future events like these. And a reminder that tonight's event is free, but donations are welcome. A big thank you to many of you who made a donation. We really appreciate it. And tomorrow you will be receiving a survey asking what you thought about the program. Please fill it out. It helps us a lot. We're always looking for feedback and we want to make the next program even better for you. So please go ahead and fill that out when you see it in your inbox. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Dr. Katherine Leonard is professor of history at Boston University, where she serves as the inaugural Abbott Lowell Cummings Fellow in American Material Culture. Prior to coming to BU, Dr. Leonard served as a Thinking Matters Fellow at Stanford University, where she taught classes on the Civil War and popular memory, transnational American history, and the history of design. She holds a PhD in American culture from the University of Michigan, an MA in visual and critical studies from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and a BFA in theatrical costume design from the Theater School of DePaul University. In addition to her forthcoming book, Manufacturing the Ku Klux Klan, Robes, Race, and the Birth of an Icon, she has published in the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era and the Journal of American Studies. And it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Leonard.
Hi, everyone. So delightful to see you. And I have to admit something, which is that I'm beaming to you from Brookline, not Cambridge. So I hope you'll accept me across the river here. So I wanted to start us off today with just a little bit of, I have just a brief presentation, a couple of slides. And I have been asked to give a little bit of a shape to our conversation and thinking about like, what is material culture? What is the study of material culture as a field? And specifically, we're doing this in the context of thinking about the material culture of the pandemic. So, since March of 2020 in the US, a little bit earlier in parts of China, but this is very recent history that we are all living through and continue to live through. But we're going to be thinking today about what do objects tell us in that history, and how do objects help us to understand this moment that we are occupying? So I'm going to pull up my slides here. All right. So this is the Pandemic Roadshow with History Cambridge, History Cafe event. And I wanted to start us off with these two nurses from 1918 in Boston. So these were two nurses fighting the global pandemic flu. And I wanted to start off with this because I think we've spent a lot of time this year wearing masks, and or the last 2 years wearing masks. And these masks look pretty familiar, frankly. And so I just wanted to give us a little bit of a grounding in thinking about how we're connecting to past moments through objects here. As Beth said, I'm a Abbott Lowell Cummings postdoctoral fellow in American Material Culture at BU. And I study, my book is on the history of Ku Klux Klan robes, but I'm really interested in the study of dress and clothing and objects more broadly. Also, I apologize, I have a toddler who's going to bed right now, so you might hear some noises. All right, let's get started. So I wanted to start this off with a little bit of a framing of where I'm coming from, which is that I started the pandemic in Redwood City, a little bit south of San Francisco, and I was teaching at Stanford at the time. This is my favorite headline from that moment, that the sharks were gathering and responded to Santa Clara County's ban on large gatherings. But this is the last photograph I took in a grocery store right before everything closed down. And this is my husband and my French press breaking the night that everything closed down, and we had a momentary panic of not being able to access coffee. So we've been thinking a lot about objects, and how we get objects, I think, has become really visible in the last couple of years. Specifically, as we're thinking about supply chains, access to stuff. I remember being in this grocery store line and hearing someone in front of me talking about how she needed to stock up on toilet paper, and thinking, like, what is going on? And I think this is something that, we all have experienced in the last couple of years, and a kind of attention to this globalized world that we're living in, and access to stuff that is new for a lot of Americans. So it's something that a lot of Americans haven't really had to grapple with, a lack of access to things. So after that, my husband and I had a baby, the toddler that you hear yelling in the background, in the midst of the pandemic in July of 2020. And we stayed in California for a while, and then we packed up all of our stuff and moved to Ohio, where my parents live. So we started in California, moved to Ohio. And part of this experience for me has been one of, on a really practical level, just having to go through all of my possessions, put them in boxes, think about why I own things, think about why I'm moving them cross country, why I'm transporting them, and what they mean to me. So you see here a couple of images of moving in process, sorting, digging through piles of, vintage bags from thrift stores that I found in my early 20s that I had to decide if they moved cross country again, all of that. When we got to Ohio, we found my mom has some pretty significant archives of her own. And so on the left is a photo of me in a jumpsuit in 1982. On the right is my son in the same jumpsuit that we found in that suitcase right there. The cat is not the same, but they look like the same cat, which is surprising. But again, this was a period of not only thinking about the significance of my items, but also thinking about reuse. How do items create new meaning over time? How do we get new, items can have a new kind of lease on life after long periods of disuse. So when we think about material culture, scholars talk about the social life of an object, which is sort of thinking about its process of manufacturing, distribution, use, exchange, circulation, but even within families, items can be reused over and over again to different ends. And then finally, we got to Boston in July of this year, and on the left is a storage cube full of our stuff that had a little bit of a hard trip from California that we hadn't seen in 8 months when we opened it up. So again, just thinking about the complexity of getting things from place to place, and what all of these sort of boring, normal objects, what they mean, what their potential. And looking at this storage unit on the left, nothing broke, but when I opened it up, I thought it had all broken and had a little bit of a moment there. So just trying to think about what are our relationships with our objects, and for me, this pandemic time has been one of understanding my relationship in the world in a new way, but also understanding my relationship with just the things that I own and my possessions, partly because of something that had nothing to do with the pandemic, which was just moving multiple times across the country. But really, starting to think again anew about what do mundane objects, what kind of value do they carry, what kind of meaning do they carry? So just to frame our conversation here, material culture studies is really coming out of it's bringing together two different concepts. So first is the material, so thinking about the tangible presence of human-made objects and the processes of production, consumption, and circulation, what I call that social life of objects. And then culture, which is shared practices, so thinking about language, gesture, values, and concepts, so things like race, gender, nation, that shape everyday life and the power structures of everyday life. So if you put those together, material culture studies, we get a field that's interested in how objects shape the ways that people understand the world in which they live. We get the sense that cultural meaning is made and circulated through the process of producing and consuming even really mundane objects. And that artifacts, deep looking into artifacts, can offer insight into both the lived experiences of people living in the past, but can also convey something about the values, priorities, and power structures of the place and time in which they were made and used. So I wanted to just quickly run through kind of how one way to do this, how I think about this. So I usually, when I'm teaching material culture, we use a 3-step process. So the first is close observation of an object. And so here I ask students to use all their senses, think about the materials, the visible traces of construction or use, dimension, weight, smell. Is this something that's familiar? Have you seen anything like it before? Where are you viewing the object? Is this in a museum? Is this in a private collection? Is it in someone's house? And does that provide any further information? That's the provenance of the object, the history of its ownership and storage and display. And does that provide any extra information about the object? So here we're looking at a stack of folded pink and green fabric. We've got some ties hanging off them that looks like it's been cut from a piece of stretchy fabric, maybe a t-shirt. There's a big stack of these items. Okay, so next we think about historical context. So where and when was the object made? Who made it? Where and when was it used? By whom? What can you learn about the life cycle of similar objects? So thinking analogously, starting to look at other similar items and thinking about their design, manufacture, distribution, reuse, use, reuse, and disuse. And what are the historical conditions of the moment of production and use? And so you'd probably need other kinds of historical sources to answer these questions. And for our case, for thinking about objects in the pandemic, we are the historical sources. So we are one set of historical sources that we can use to find that information. But it might be talking to other people. It might be reading newspapers. It might be looking at photographs. It might be finding other kinds of information. So these items, the stack of pleated fabric, these are all produced in June of 2020 in California at my house. This was a moment where there's lots of people around the country making homemade masks to various specifications that they were finding on the internet. You could find lots of patterns. You could find Facebook groups. We could find different ways of thinking about how people could start to create a mass of these items while at home. So step 3, for my students, I just ask them to think about interpretation. So building on what they know already, what values, ideas, or shared cultural meaning do these objects convey? What is the significance of this object in a historical moment of its production and consumption? Does that significance change over time? What does this object illuminate about the historical moment that we're trying to understand? So thinking about this, we have a stack of masks. They're homemade masks. They're not very well made masks. I can tell you from personal experience. The materials were pretty crude. I received them in a bag that was dropped off at the front gate of my apartment and then picked up later. So this was a group that was crowdsourcing, making masks for people who needed them. And I think when we start to think about interpretation, we can start to think about the meaning of these objects, right? And so, I can tell you what these objects meant to me, which is about a trying to find an opportunity to create community, to create connection amidst a moment where we're really isolated. But you could do interpretation of the meaning of these objects that is not just based on what I think about them, right? As the maker, but you are yourself an interpreter of the cultural world. And so, I would invite my students to think about these objects, like what kind of bigger historical trends, what kind of values do they capture in this moment of the pandemic, of isolation, thinking about that need for community. and that need to do something material to try to help people safe in a moment of real uncertainty. So, our mandate for today is to think about how artifacts help us to understand the daily lives and values of Cambridge residents living through a period of dramatic social upheaval. And here I have a photograph from June 2020 of a Black Lives Matter demonstration in Cambridge. And I put this up because I think that it's important to note that a lot of museums and historical collections have been collecting signs, banners, flyers, all of these kind of tangible objects and tangible forms of expression from protests in the summer of 2020. They've ended up in a lot of collections. And in part, that's really, that's really easy in some ways as an item of material culture, because they tell us what their what their meaning is. They have text, and it's never cheating to read the text on an object. But I think that, the items that we're going to see tonight also have really powerful, convey really powerful meaning and really powerful sense of what it has meant to live in this moment, what people's values are, what people's priorities have been in the last 2 years. So I want to just quickly run through a couple of things that objects, I'm trying to think about how objects can help us to see the past. So here we have objects offering visible evidence of historical events. So what I mean by that is objects that you can see traces of historical change, of actual time passing, of events happening to an object. So these are some hiking boots with melted soles that were worn by hikers in the Grand Canyon in June of 2020 because due to the warming climate, the area got so hot that people's shoes started melting. So looking at this, we could start to see actual physical evidence of change over time happening on objects themselves. We can also see objects as offering a sense of the historical moment that persists beyond that original moment, and that can make the past visible in new ways. So this is a fallout shelter sign just outside Boston University, and these are, I'm sure you're all very familiar with these signs. They're all over the city of Boston. Sean Colby is a firefighter who has a great website called Fallout 50, which talks about fallout shelters in the greater Boston area. But these fallout shelters were only operational for about 2 years, and most of them were never actually built. I think there's a great article in the Harvard Crimson about how the fallout shelters at Harvard were never stocked with items, even though they were supposed to be. And someone was saying, like, this is a really big problem. What are we doing? So, we could start to think about ideas around safety, around the perception of safety. How do these objects help us to connect to that past moment, see the persistence of that past moment in our present, but also what are these objects trying to do and what kind of messages were they trying to convey? We can also think about the absence of artifacts. So when there are not artifacts that we can see, that can still operate as a kind of historical evidence. And here is, one of Boston's most famous examples of this, which are the empty frames at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, following the heist of these paintings. But, I think there's a lot of opportunities to think about where the absence of things is still a kind of, we can still operate in a material culture method there, trying to think about, like, why do these things not persist? Why do we not have these items? And we can think about, in my field, in the history of clothing, we talk a lot about clothing of enslaved people and how there's not very many extant garments that were worn by enslaved people because those garments got used so much, right? So that absence is another kind of evidence that we can still start to read and think about. And finally, disaster and social upheaval can disrupt the process of accessing historical context. And I think that's really important to note here. We can have disruptions of historical context. This is a photograph. This was circulating in the news just a couple of days ago, but this was a photograph from a family. I think it was a family in either Tennessee or Kentucky, and it was found 100 miles away in the path of the tornado that just passed through last week. And this was big internet news and got reunited with the original family. But we saw this in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. We see this in the wake of a lot of different kinds of moments of disaster where objects are separated from their context and we no longer have access to them. So it's another, thinking about this moment of pandemic, thinking about this moment of social rupture that is happening and people being separated from their communities, from their contexts in various ways. That opens up some big questions about the provenance of objects and how we access them. So finally, I want to say that objects historical events themselves can change the meaning and significance of mundane objects. And this is something that I think we'll see a lot of tonight. On the right is just a list of objects in the National Museum of American History's Hurricane Katrina collection. And there's items like just a kitchen clock and handmade lace curtains, right? Items that may have meaning to the individual, but are not particularly historically significant in a big global sense until they became evidence of this event. They became artifacts that represented and took on new meaning of this event after the fact. So, that's a question I want to ask us, is thinking about like, how do the objects that we're going to be looking at tonight, are these items that were imbued with meaning from the start? Are they objects that have new meaning thrust upon them by the context of the pandemic? How does that meaning change over time? So really, how do objects help us to understand the past, or in our case for this, really understand our ongoing present? And we can think as recent historians thinking about the recent past as something that we are already slightly detached from. If you think of that moment of early March 2020 as a different kind of historical moment than the one we're in right now, but there's definitely some real continuities there. So we're thinking about objects as ways of understanding both the recent past and our ongoing present moving into the future. So this is, as I said, this is that question I think we're organized around today. How can artifacts help us understand the daily lives and values of Cambridge residents living through a period of dramatic social upheaval? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Beth to hear about some objects.
Thank you so much, Katie. I think there's so much for us to delve into. I'm going to go ahead and just put up the first slide. I'm going to share my screen. And these are a few of the objects that folks have shared with us. And I'm going to actually ask if, let me turn it on slideshow. Oops, sorry. Beginning. So I'm actually going to ask if, I'm trying to see who all is here, if Barbara Martin was our submitter for this. This is a basket that she made out of newspaper, out of the New York Times, I believe, to hold all of her mail. And I believe she did it while she was on Zoom calls and kind of whiling away the time while she was on those Zoom calls. So she wove this basket, and it's still being used by her. I think it was early in the pandemic that she did it, but it's still holding all of her junk mail and her scrap envelopes for writing notes. So I don't know if you want to delve in with this one.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually love to open it up to the group a little bit. What are all of you seeing in this object, thinking about it in the context of, does this feel like an object that visibly immediately represents this pandemic moment? What are you seeing here?
Folks can feel free to just jump in if you want to unmute yourself, or if you have something you want to put in the chat. It captures the need to stay occupied.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely.
There's something very steady, I think, about the idea that the mail, even though it's mostly junk mail, keeps coming, right? It's something that that is steady. Oh, somebody said connections. Yep. Connections to the outside
Mhm.
world. And yep.
I keep thinking about trying to make something new with stuff you have around the house, right? That moment where it was hard to go get things, where supply chains are being disrupted. Having the opportunity to think about what can I make that's beautiful with the things that I have access to pretty readily.
I'd also think about the fact that it's things to do to fill the time, and being creative in a vacuum.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that comment that someone made about connections, I mean, I think that's incredibly important, right? Is to create, I mean, there's something extremely tender to me about creating a vessel to hold, even if it is mostly junk mail, to hold connections with the outside world, is really, that feels really representative of the ways that we've been trying to think about making community, making space.
I'm interested in the fact that Barbara got the information about how to make it from the New York Times, not from her mother, not from her grandmother. This is not something that was passed on. This is something that was passed on by news media. But very useful. And she made something wonderful.
Absolutely. And that the New York Times is not just that she got the instructions from the New York Times, but the New York Times is printing this, right? I mean, the paper of record is giving us home literally basket weaving instructions. Is a kind of a wild turn of events, really. But tells you a lot about how, even people in the highest reaches of media are also understanding that people are trying to keep occupied, trying to make connections, trying to fill this space. Anybody else on this one?
I'll move
Beth,
to it.
wait.
Hold on one second. Oh, and it's made from the New York Times. Yes, it's made from the New York Times with instructions from the New York Times. So multi-purpose.
I love it. Maybe Beth, let's do a couple and then we can start to think about connections across the objects too.
Absolutely. Okay. Let me see. Next. I'm gonna stop my share for 1 second because it is giving me trouble moving to the next slide. Hold on. Okay. Sorry, we've got this one. Okay. So I know that the folks who created this are on the call. So Laura and Ed, you all can duke it out about who gets to talk about it first.
Laura just walked in, came out for the phone.
Okay.
It's as you can see, a map of Cambridge. And what happened is early on in the pandemic, like many other people, we were going for walks, just getting some exercise, getting out of the house. But walking around your neighborhood after the first 20 or 30 times gets to be kind of old. So we decided to walk every street in Cambridge. And how many miles are there, Laura?
145.
145 miles. So we took this map, a somewhat old map of when we had around, and just started taking, you can't see it, but the blue lines to every street as we walked them. And, it's just basically kept a record of what we did for the first few months of the pandemic on the outside.
It was actually, we started after the first year. It was about 8 months in when we started. It was in the winter time. We started right after Christmas of 2019.
So does this one resonate with anyone? Anybody have any immediate thoughts on this? And we could think about this both as an object that has, aesthetic qualities that are really interesting, and then also as a record of a practice, right? It's kind of a documentation of a performance, which is interesting. So we could think about this as the material form of a durational practice of performance. Anybody have any thoughts on this one?
I'd actually like to just ask a follow-up question for Ed and Laura. Where does this live now that it is done? Like, what is the current use of the object? Do you have it up for display, or what does it do now?
Good question.
Well, so as we were working on it, so it's mounted on foam core very inexpertly. It was kept in the dining room because we would come home and we would pour our coffee or whatever, and we would figure out what we had done. You can see how badly it's cut in the lower right-hand corner. I then trimmed it, and it actually sits in my office. There's a perfect space for it. It's not something I look at constantly. It's behind me, but it just has this nice little niche on a shelf in my bookcase.
So Marika pointed out that she was very jealous of Laura and Ed being able to go on this adventure because she has a small child who she was stuck mostly inside with during the colder weather, and saying that she had a very different pandemic experience. And I think that's a really interesting point too, is that this represents a certain kind of experience and an ability to do this that maybe is different from what other folks were able to do or not do.
I'm also not sure what it means, but I think this is something that we never would have done if it were not for the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how to interpret that in terms of the things you were talking about. Yeah.
And it's interesting, there was another woman who was doing it, a school teacher, who made a much bigger deal of it. She was blogging and she publicized when her last mile was going to be, and she got the mayor to walk with her on the last mile and the whole bit. And we never wrote about it. People would say, oh, what wonderful things have you discovered? And we'd look at each other and say, well, not really. There was that street that had some cool houses, and we stopped and we got lunch from that Mexican place on Cambridge Street, but we knew the city pretty well. So it wasn't like a voyage of discovery, but it was, the two of us just spending an hour together every day in the fresh air and talking to each other and looking around. Also, it was winter, so it wasn't like we had gardens to look at. So it was kind of meditative in its own way.
Kind of, you're saying, why did we do this? I'm hearing.
No, we loved doing it, but it was really sort of, it was more like meditation than hiking.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to complete?
Well, we started we kind of marked off the streets that we walk all the time. We didn't repeat all of those. And so that was probably, I don't know, a quarter or a third of the city.
And we know exactly which day we started because they were picking up
Christmas trees, yes. We ran at the garbage trucks picking up the Christmas trees, and we ended in
middle of March.
Mid-March, yeah.
So it took about 10 weeks. And we did it just about every day, even though it was cold. Last winter wasn't so bad. And some days it was icy, but when we were doing a really boring neighborhood, we would go early if there was a good bakery, and we would end with picking up breakfast. And then in some ethnic neighborhoods, we would go later in the morning and pick up lunch on the way home.
So what is your relationship to walking in Cambridge now that this period is done, this project is over?
I think both of us are kind of walkers. I mean, we do walk a lot. We live, it's one of the wonderful things about living in Cambridge is you can walk to things, and so I think that, I'm not sure it's changed. It does mean there are large segments of Cambridge that I feel I never have to walk those streets again, like parts of Sydney. But it also, the other thing, it did introduce us. We said before, there were pieces of Cambridge we didn't even know were part of Cambridge, on the edges up by Belmont, particularly. That area in the corner there. And so that was kind of nice and saw a lot of, but we've gone back to our usual, just kind of walking in places we know. I don't think this introduced this saying, okay, let's go back and maybe we should include Somerville next time.
It's too hilly. One of the things about Cambridge is that it's really quite flat.
Sure.
I think it was a brilliant use of time. And a very creative idea to just do it all and just carry through. I love the idea. I think it's just.
And in in addition to the teacher who was doing it, Helly, you probably know Owen Gingrich. I think Owen Gingrich was done years ago.
Gingrich is what?
I think Owen Gingrich walked all the streets of Cambridge years ago.
Really? He
I
lives
think-
on my street.
I mean,
Well, ask
so I
him.
probably did, yeah.
I think David Ellis told me that.
I don't know.
It's a thing. It's a thing. That's the other thing about it,
Yeah.
which is that, so for example, we have a friend, and he and 3 other friends are trying to run every street in their town, but they have different rules than we do. And there was a guy I encountered on Twitter who was walking every street of like Birmingham, England. It's, that whole thing of, creating a list and making sure you check off every item on the list. Ed has hiked all the 4,000 footers in New Hampshire. And so I think it also falls into that practice, which isn't a material culture practice, but is a practice of sort of organizing your time and organizing your diversion.
And giving yourself a challenge or something to, meet.
Right.
I'm incredibly interested in the fact that you chose to document it with an object, because I can say from California walking 8 months pregnant, my husband and I used an app where we were tracking. So he has an app that unfogs, the whole world is fogged, and then it unfogs streets as you walk down them. And this was really good in California because there's so many dead ends in the Bay Area. It's just like every street is a cul-de-sac. And so it was the only way we could get ourselves to go on these kind of boring walks down a cul-de-sac and then back to the main street again. But it was like, okay, we could cross off the street, but it was a virtual thing, right? And I'm really interested in the choice here, how you chose to put it on a map, this map, the pen, just the material practice of it.
Yeah, it was, we did use Map My Walk. We used that while we were walking, to keep track of where we were. And as you say, there are a lot of cul-de-sacs and you can walk down them, or kind of, that half block that you have to then go back and pick up because you've gone back and forth. And then we transferred it to this. And I think it was as much that there was, as Laura said, it lived on the table, where we tended to have coffee and eat. And so there was a kind of physical embodiment of what we had accomplished, as opposed to having to bring it up on the screen and say, what next? The 2 of us could look at it, and so I think in that sense, having something tangible as opposed to purely virtual made it, I don't know, easier, more rewarding. I'm not quite sure, but
we also took a picture of the neighborhood that we were going to walk every day. So on my phone, I have all of these pictures of little chunks of Cambridge. And deciding which chunk you were going to do, I think, was much easier to do on a map than it would have been virtually. Also, I started the recording, and I'm the museum person, and he started using the app. He's the digital person. We say in my house that I'm analog and he's digital.
There's also something about looking at the object itself that, I think it's the thinking of you walking the streets, but also that you trace the streets with a pen. It's kind of that the repeated motion, right? That retracing, literally retracing of your steps. But there's something about that really makes the weird map, all of these little tiny grids cut up together, the strange shape of Cambridge. It really draws that into relief for me. And I'm a new resident, so I don't know this geography very well, but there's something about that you tracing your path with the pen that really just highlights what a kind of oddly put together space Cambridge is.
Well, that's really true, because it is, you think of it more as neighborhoods, and when you look at that, and I guess we've all seen maps of Cambridge, we don't usually think about how those neighborhoods fit together and slot together. And it did give us that, because when you're walking it, you're at street level, you just don't see the big picture. And so this gives us again a more tangible and representation of what we've been doing. And I like that.
I love that. This is a really cool object.
All right, I'm going to move to our next one. 1 second. Go back. And all right. And this one, we don't have the young lady that created this, but we do have her mom on here. So I don't know. So this is a painting by our young friend Scarlett, and she took up painting as something new that she was passionate about during the pandemic. And I see Amy is unmuted, so this is Amy, her mom. And do you want to say a little bit about Scarlett and her painting journey?
Hi, everyone. Yes, my daughter Scarlett, she is almost 12. She'll be 12 in a few weeks, but she was 10 at the time. And she was thrown into online school like so many children. And we had a lot of upheaval. We had just renovated our home and it wasn't quite done. So we had moved multiple times leading up to the pandemic. We ended up kind of living down on Cape Cod because our house wasn't done. So we were removed from family and friends and from her classmates. So it was really, really difficult. But she's always been a creative kid, and we had some paint and we had some canvases, and she just took to it and she started creating, and it was something she could share, in FaceTime with her grandparents. And it was something that passed the time, and it was just a really beautiful hobby that came out of a really dark time for us, I would say.
And the first thing that strikes me about this object is just thinking about the passage. It really seems to mark the passage of time in a really beautiful way. You know, you said your daughter is almost 12, but she was 10, at the beginning of this, and what a large period of her life this has been so far. There's something here about just, the eons between being 10 and 12 being marked by this object that feels really powerful to me in looking at that. What does everyone else see in this?
Feels hopeful. It does, yeah.
It's a lovely object.
It really is.
I love that she
Right.
said in what you sent, Amy, that it was a way for her to travel, to be wherever she was painting, wherever she was envisioning, in the midst of not being able to go many places.
Yeah, she's a dreamy kid, and I think you can see it in this painting. Yeah, I'm really proud of her. Looking at this has really, brought me back.
Has she kept it up, Amy?
She does. Yeah, she has. Oh, so many Christmas presents have been prepared for this year. So she really has, and it's a hobby we're certainly happy to foster, and so it has endured, which is great.
Has her style changed over this time? I mean, can you see, when you look at this, do you see a change over time, or does this feel like this is part of a bigger body of painting from this moment?
She does carry some parts of her artistic makeup with her. I do see how she has evolved as an artist, and I cannot draw a stick figure. I mean, I have absolutely no ability, so I admire it so much. But I do see a progression, and it would be interesting to kind of line things up and record that for her so she can maybe see it too.
I mean, I'm really, this makes me want to ask lots of questions about how long a painting takes her. I mean, this seems like there's a lot of care in this blending that we're seeing coming up the top, right? She's really, I think, laying out these stars pretty carefully. Like there's just a lot of, you can see that time, and I think that that object we looked at the beginning, the basket, where it's that sense of occupation, like finding something to fill your space and fill your time, but also doing that in a way that's really, really beautiful with a lot of care. Feels really significant and representative of a lot of the ways that a lot of us have tried to fill space in this period. Can I ask one more question of this? I'm curious, when she started painting, did she start during the pandemic or did she start prior? And either way, where did you have any problems getting supplies? Like, how was the process of just collecting stuff to be raw materials for this? How was that?
It wasn't easy. Yeah, she's always been a drawer and a doodler. You know, she used to mostly use markers and crayons and whatnot. So, but we had gotten her some paints, thinking that she was ready to tackle that medium. And she quickly went through them, and then it really was difficult to get things. We didn't want to order things because we didn't want to be taking up energy that, you know, otherwise could be helping people get food or you know, necessary things. We didn't want to do that. So eventually my husband braved the local hardware store, and luckily they had some supplies, so we stocked up for her, and she kept on going.
I mean, to me, that's also really emblematic of this moment, is trying to think about our competing priorities and how, you know, we have these objects that are really representations of materialized, you know, this kind of values conflict, that sense of like wanting to make sure your kid gets to express herself, gets to feel creative, gets to feel safe in a really scary and uncertain time, and also wanting to be good citizens and not wanting to jam up the supply chain. I mean, I think that's a really important part of this moment, has been trying to figure out how to be responsible.
Right.
And we're all doing that right now. I think a lot of people are making those choices right now about holiday travel, right? Like just trying to be part of a community in a way that feels livable to us, when everything about how we know how to have community is really disrupted. So that I think this object really gets me to that place, certainly.
Okay, let me do our next one. And
Amy, please thank Scarlett for sharing her work with the broader community.
I will. Thank you all for having such a lovely response to it.
so let's see. Okay, so Helly, you are here and you are up. Let's see. Come on, slideshow.
Oh,
Well, I'm going to leave it like this. I don't know why it's not coming up as a big screen, but you can tell that it's a screenshot that Helly sent us of her book club.
yeah. So my book club was, I'm actually in 2 book clubs. This was just one of them, but it was very sustaining, and it's always been, but when you can't really be with other people, having, you know, spending 2 hours talking about something you all enjoy, it was just very sustaining and meaningful. And somebody suggested taking a screenshot of us all, and and somebody else knew how to do it, and so it worked, and it was lovely. That's about it. I mean, they're all smart, interesting people, and so it was just wonderful to spend time with them.
What I love about this image is that it, you know, sometimes I end up using images as ways to study objects, right? And this image, if we're thinking just in terms of material culture, this image gives us views into so many people's houses. And I think that's the funniest part of this last couple of years here is being in book clubs, being in meetings, teaching classes, where your own stuff is in the background. And that's just not something many of us are used to doing. We're used to doing prior to this, and now it's commonplace. I mean, I actually can't imagine any other context prior to this in which I would give a presentation with a toddler yelling in the background, but now it's just, of course, toddlers yell in the background because we're at home. So, I mean, I love this as just a way of thinking about how seeing other people's, what the meaning of seeing other people's stuff was for me. But I'm curious for all of you, what did seeing objects in people's homes, seeing glimpses into homes of coworkers and, you know, people that maybe you wouldn't always be in their spaces or you wouldn't have been in their spaces. What did that mean to all of you in this pandemic moment?
Well, you know, it's interesting because I taught online before the pandemic, and it was very common for people to not even turn on their cameras. And now people are, I mean, we don't have our camera on because we're walking around the kitchen, but people are so much more comfortable. And they're also, particularly last year, when everyone was so, I teach in the fall, so tense and so fearful, it allowed you to lighten up the feeling, you know, to talk about their dogs, to talk about whether they have their Christmas decorations up yet or not, and to just restore humanity. I mean, when you look at someone's house, you're back with their humanity. And also you sort of, I know that picture behind Beth's head because I've been seeing it behind Beth's head for innumerable Zoom calls now for 18 months. So you sort of, I'm really anxious to see some of my friends' houses, to see what's on either side of that painting that's their computers in front of.
Yeah, that's a really good point that we, you know, nonetheless do, while people are in their houses and it's a little bit more, you know, a little bit less controlled than perhaps a self-presentation at an office environment, we're still, you know, you're looking at the quilt behind me and not the pile of coats just to the left on the table, the same table that my computer's on, right? We're still framing ourselves and framing our stuff. And I think that's why I love this image actually, because it's a book club, it doesn't have that kind of professionalism or that what I do when I'm teaching classes, which is try to, you know, cut out some of the incidental stuff. I don't want to be distracted, have it be a distraction. And what I love here are seeing, you know, people in a book club with stacks of books behind them. You know, you could see, even if I didn't know this was a book club, I'd know this was a group of readers. And that alone is really fascinating, right? That there is this, I mean, I think this point that was just made about that sort of connection of humanity, like the idea that seeing people's stuff makes them feel more real in a way, is really interesting.
I'm curious about the concept of the screenshot as well, and how, I mean, because so many different groups and different programs I've been on or meetings have all wanted to do a screenshot of whatever that moment is in the collective experience. And just I have a whole bunch of them on my computer now, and I don't really know what I'm going to do with them. And I don't know that I'm necessarily going to always be going back to look at them, but I have saved them and I want to keep them. And I'm kind of curious about what that says too.
Well, I think it's the pandemic equivalent of taking a picture of everybody standing together next to each other in front of, you know, the steps or some wall who had just gotten together. And in some ways it you know, it creates a little community that we remember. You know, it's kind of, oh yeah, this was the time when the book club all talked about that. And it'll be interesting years from now when you look at it, Beth, the pictures, you have all those pictures. It's going to bring back this time when instead of getting together, we got together, on a computer.
One of the most dynamic things I saw happen via Zoom were the Boston Playwrights Theater 10-minute plays, which were this year, they knew they were going to be on Zoom. And some of them were actual Zoom encounters. The play was written about a Zoom exchange. Some of them were, you had to believe these two people were meeting in a parking lot and you saw the parking lot behind each of them. But, the ingenuity of that. And also I found out later there was, they got quite skilled at, looking at each, so they seemed to be facing each other. They were talking back and forth, et cetera. But there was one in which they were clearly, somehow they'd gotten it bollocksed up. So they were facing away from each other, even though they were supposed to have a conversation. And I knew the person involved with the whole program, and I asked him about it. And he said, oh, it's absolutely in the order that you enter, is how the boxes line up, and you have to do it right. And it's like making your entrance on stage, sorry, my phone is ringing, but, and so I'll always remember that kind of as like Zoom territory, and how those actors and directors learn to, work around it, and then every now and then slip up, so. And those were certainly, that was not a tangible object, but those plays, it was like for 2, I don't know if anyone else watched it, but I think it was, what is it? It's 50 plays. So it was 50 days, every day at noon, 10-minute play, discussion afterwards. So it was like a half an hour, and it was live. You had to be there. And that, it's not an object, but it is absolutely something I will remember as getting me through, being very important, the sort of tent pole of my day during the pandemic.
There's something really powerful in what you're saying, Barbara, too, about just our awareness of technology and of objects. There's theorists who said that we become aware of objects, of mundane objects, when they break and when they stop working. Bruno Latour talks about this, and I think that's what you're talking about with the people facing away is such a perfect example of this, right? Is that we are trying so hard to adapt to our new circumstances, and nonetheless, there's still these moments where it's like, oh, I can't, we can't do it. And I'm thinking of this screenshot as well. The other thing that's striking to me about this screenshot is that there's 6 people, which to me is about the maximum number of people that you can have on a Zoom without having it be a kind of facilitated conversation, right? That's like, you're really up against the wall there of how many people can talk in a natural way. And even that is kind of pushing it, right? And so this screenshot is also making me think of just how we, during this period, have really had, I think there's been a big challenge of trying to figure out how to have incidental conversations, I've been to a bunch of department meetings that are department events, parties that are sort of like everybody in a little box, just waving hi, not sure how to have conversation and connect using these technologies that break and that stutter and that we're on Zooms and it gets glitchy. And so I think this screenshot also just that 6 person, that 6 tile really I think evokes something about how we've had to not only think about new ways to make connections over distance, but actually think of new ways to understand how we can connect in groups. Because the mediating technologies make that really challenging in lots of different ways.
Including because we're missing one of the essential sets of objects from book groups, which is the food.
Yes, absolutely.
Having just come from my book group.
Yeah, I was thinking about that with a department reception the other day where we got sealed boxes of cookies to walk away with. And just thinking about academic spaces, I mean, graduate students, how are graduate students going to eat? They need free food. So just big changes in how we connect with one another through stuff in this space.
Okay, I'm gonna move. Oh, this is actually mine. And this was the first of many, unfortunately, many signs that we made for drive-by birthday parties. This is my son. At the time was 7. He's 9 now. And this was his friends who are twins in school with him, and they were the first ones in our circle to have a birthday parade. And I think there's some balloons on one side under the happy face. I think that's what they are. But Ethan, the little boy, loves Pokemon. So my son taped his Pokemon cards to the sign for him, and we put balloons and streamers and everything and drove by their house. So this was something that we had saved from our first, and we actually assembled a kit that we would put on with like a banner and streamers and a big pack of balloons, and we would kind of reuse a bunch of different things as we went on, since we had so many that we were doing. But yeah.
I mean, this seems to amp up the conversation we were having with Scarlett's painting about the passage of time. You know, this is that on steroids, where you really see kids having their second pandemic birthdays. I mean, all of us, but it's a bigger deal when it's your 7th. You've only had 7.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm realizing that that folks can't see it. So hold on one second. Let me go move to it and share.
I mean, while Beth is doing that, I'd be curious,
Okay.
you know, along with this and thinking about analogous objects, or thinking about this as a kind of collective practice that we saw happening, just if there were other material ways that the rest of you marked special events, or, you know, this kind of like birthdays, but also weddings, anniversaries. I know my parents celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary, and drove around and gave a bunch of friends that had been at their wedding, dropped off envelopes with $40 to get themselves to order out some dinner, because they would have had a party, but they couldn't have a party. And so they got to, you know, make a little map and drive around and drop off those envelopes. But, you know, these sort of different ways that we're thinking about, like, what is important about the celebration of an event? How do you stage? Because that's what this object gets me to, is thinking about, you know, you could just drop off a present, right? So what is it about that, the sign, the kind of public statement of excitement, trying to express a feeling through a thing is such an interesting phenomenon that we've been grappling with.
We actually have, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, my sister celebrated her 65th birthday, April 17th, 2020. So it was just about a month into the shutdown. And, you know, it was a couple of us from the family and her best friend from college, et cetera. And I made a sign that fit over the photograph, the framed photograph on the wall behind me. And I found that, you know, I could construct it so I could take it off and cover it with something else. I used it a couple of other times, you know, so that I appeared at events with a sign behind me.
We had a man, and no, I mean, not no one, I'm sure people do know his name, but most people just know him as the birthday car man. And he just has this very, like, I don't know, Toyota Camry, something very kind of plain ordinary car, but he has a ginormous fake birthday cake on the top. And he just posted on our neighborhood Facebook page was like, anybody that needs a birthday parade, like I will come, just tell me where to go and I'll come and bring my birthday card to your parade. And then there were also like for kids that, some kids really love the police or firefighters, and they got in on the action. We had like a police car with sirens, or a fire engine did one that we went to. And so really rallying for the specifics of the kids that they were, and even the teenagers. My daughter's about to be 18, and so these were like, some kids had sweet 16 birthdays, and really the older kids definitely appreciated it as well. So it wasn't just the little ones. So
I mean, that evokes graduations too, right? That this and the ongoing conversation about proms and the things that mark adolescence in this very, not for every American kid by any means, but in a kind of big cultural normative expectations, and that this has been such a disruption of that. So how are people using, I mean, this feels like just such a strong example to me of people using objects, using signs. I mean, this is not unlike the protest signs too, right? The Black Lives Matter protest signs. It's like, I have to make it a form of expression that is big and legible, and not to be confused. There's no ambiguity of this. We're really excited about Ethan and Rebecca's birthday.
And more so, right? Even than you might be, it's almost, I mean, it's all caps. It's like I'm shouting it at them, right? Like, which I wouldn't do if I brought my son to their birthday party. I wouldn't be like, happy birthday! But it feels like the energy and the effort and the emotion have to be over the top, because the the physical connection is so distant.
And is this a sign that you made?
Yeah, I wrote the letters, and my son put the decorations on. So
right. I mean, which is not different perhaps than procuring a birthday present for a friend in your kid's class, but there is something about not just, as you're saying, this kind of shouting happy birthday, like you're the one shouting. You're the one writing that out.
Exactly.
And that's an interesting, that I don't know, also just thinking about how kids have needed adult help to have these kinds of relationships not that they don't usually, but in a really different way. They don't have school spaces where they're not, or well, depending on what part of the country they were in. With schools being closed, you didn't have spaces where the kids could just have unmediated relationships with each other. So that's just a really interesting set of questions that this brings up for me, is just thinking about the roles, the new kinds of roles that adults have had to play in helping their kids connect with other kids their age, and keeping, helping kids keep distance, or asking kids to keep distance, or forcing kids to keep distance in some cases. And I can only imagine, Beth, with having 7-year-old to 18-year-old, those negotiations. I mean, every kid's different, but those negotiations are really different depending on the age of the kid. So just trying to figure out, we had an ongoing conversation about like what age of kid would be hardest to manage during the pandemic. And we settled on young toddler, which we didn't have at the time, but I think like anybody that had a preschooler, I don't know how they did it, but during lockdowns, I mean, but yeah, that different ways of connecting, and the roles that parents have to play here.
Yeah,
seems really important coming up with this.
And Marika is asking why this wasn't left for them, and why it came back to our house, and like why we still have it. Because it was so early on that people didn't even, they slowed down as they went by, but they didn't even feel comfortable stopping and talking through the window, like rolling down the window and talking distantly. So it was like everything. That was when people were sanitizing their mail and everything. So there was no passing of any kind of material stuff. I ended up sending their mom a gift card via email for them, but there was nothing that we touched was supposed to go back and forth, because it was such early days.
That's a really, yeah.
Oh, no, please, please.
Well, I would just think that's a really interesting point about objects in this time. That there was that first 6 months or whatever where they were, like, nobody could touch the same object you touched, kind of. That was a taboo.
And suspect, right? Like danger, that they were actually vectors of
Yeah.
danger and irresponsible too. If we go back to thinking about community, I mean, that Beth and Marika, that point seems extremely poignant when we think about the Pokemon cards here, right? Which are a game that, if I'm correct, is played with trading.
Yeah.
And actually possessing these objects. And so to have them on here and that they're still on here also seems really powerful to me. They weren't repossessed, they weren't put back in the collection.
Yeah.
Just kind of frozen here. It's really striking.
I'm going to stop sharing. That was actually our last one, but I do have, so Barbara is here with us now, and she is the creator of the amazing New York Times basket, which we showed, Barbara. So, but I wanted to give you a chance to say anything that you wanted to say about that and what it meant to you.
Well, many apologies for my late arrival. And I'll be curious, I can go back in the recording. I'd be very interested to hear what you said and what Katherine said. I guess, the thing you made, that what was the most interesting in a way, I mean, that I felt compelled to make it. There was, that there are many, many suggestions of things to do that I wasn't interested in. And then suddenly this one was just like, I have to make this. And then what I found out was fun was realize how much color there is in the newspaper. And that was the creative aspect of it, was choosing, the sheets. So, and when I showed the first one to somebody, they said, how did you dye it? How did you cut? It's like, nope, if you go to the right sections. So, and then the blank envelope scrap paper has become kind of totemic. And I was thinking about history and material culture. I was imagining that 100 years from now, what would actually be interesting to a historian was all the envelopes. Like forget the basket, but let's, what kinds of, philanthropic appeals were sent to someone in this year, which is mostly what it documents. So,
Barbara, are you a quilter or a crafter typically?
No, I'm not, because I don't have the patience. When I see quilts, I think, oh, I would love to do, I like putting the colors together, but I have about enough patience, for a basket, which takes about 45 minutes. So that was one thing I liked about it, was it was fast, comparatively speaking.
I mean, that's a fun, just thinking about objects in terms of what different interpretations we can have when we have information from the makers. Because you could absolutely read that object. I mean, it would be absolutely speculative, but if you didn't know anything about the maker, you could, start to weave a vision of someone who's a crafter, a quilter. This is a part of an ongoing practice. And this really takes me back to that early pandemic moment when everyone was making sourdough or, trying to figure out how to walk every street in Cambridge, or figuring out like, what is going to be my pandemic activity? And, I think there was an interesting kind of ongoing conversation about productivity. How am I going to spend this time well, wisely? What am I going to get out of it? What am I going to accomplish with it? So I love the creation of this basket that's in some ways, it's a practical item, but it's also, as you say, it's for holding junk mail. It's not like, it's not too precious.
No, and I did actually make 3 and then I stopped. It was one of those things where, I was briefly possessed and then it passed. So did you make the quilt behind you? Is that?
I did not.
I quilt.
bought this on Facebook Marketplace recently, and I'm going to have my students in the spring do a little digging on it. We're going to try to figure out
That's great.
what it is. Yeah, it's a pretty good one. I like it a lot.
Yeah.
So Katie, I have a question kind of going along with talking about our domestic spaces. And I'm just wondering, like, I know that during lockdown, particularly, people did a lot of things kind of in their home, in their garden, in their yard. There's a lot of home improvement stuff, and there was a lot of organization and kind of Marie Kondoing, I guess, of certain things. People kind of took a closer look at, because they were in such confined quarters, and took a closer look at their domestic situation. And then I'm wondering, if you have any insight into, as a whole, how our relationship with our own objects in the home particularly kind of changed. What is behind the urge to organize, to purge? Is that like a control mechanism? I'm just really interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, so my first thought is that some of that just has to do with, as you say, with proximity, but also new attention, and the time to organize, the time to do that work, but also being at home for most people wasn't actually particularly like relaxing, or a lot of people running after kids, or trying to take care of parents, or trying to wipe down all their groceries. There's a lot of tasks that needed to be done. So I think this sense of trying to take on big new projects, some of that is about looking at stuff with new eyes, and really trying to envisioning being in a space for a long time. I think that sense of uncertainty was really big too, where we didn't know how long we were going to be staring at our stuff. So we had to make it, we had to make it good. Or I guess maybe there were two phases there, right? There was a phase of, we all thought it wasn't going to be that long of a time that we'd be staring at our stuff. So we had to take advantage of the time to do the reorganizing, get the projects done because we were home. And then there was this moment of like, oh God, we're going to be in this for a long time. How do we, we have to reorganize. And I think there was also just a moment of not just in the Marie Kondo, trying to go through and decide what sparks joy with our stuff, but actually just a lot of people needed to repurpose spaces to be offices, to be classrooms, to be gyms, to be museums, to be classrooms, all of these things. And so I think there's just that big conversation that was happening at the beginning of the pandemic about people purging and cleaning out closets. Like, that's part of it, but it's also just that a lot of people were stuck in apartments without a lot of space to move. And I think somewhere like Boston and Cambridge, where real estate is so expensive, right? A lot of people are in small spaces. A lot of people were in spaces with roommates, with people that they wouldn't have chosen to be in houses with for a long time. I knew a couple people that were on archival fellowships and were in archival fellowship houses, and mid-pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic, and didn't have houses elsewhere and didn't know where to go. So I think it forced us to look at our stuff in new ways, but also just logistically we had to reshape and rethink the space of the home, and the fact that Americans en masse had to do that at the same time. That's a pretty unprecedented event. That kind of uniform transformation, and on some levels because of people wanting to make their space more beautiful, but also just the practical, how do we teach, how do we have kids in multiple grades of school in this tiny apartment at the same time? Like, that's just a radical historical event.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to open it up. We have a few minutes left, but I wanted to make sure that there wasn't anyone who brought something along tonight that they hadn't pre-submitted that wanted to share. And if you do, go for it. Just unmute and share. If we don't have any extra submissions that folks have brought along, I would love to give Katie the last few minutes to just sort of tie this all together. I'm going to assume, because no one has unmuted, that we are all good in the submission category, and I would love to hand it over to Katie to just kind of give us what does it all mean and where do we take it from here? It's a small order of business there.
That's what I have students for. I ask them to do this all the time. They're going to figure this out. But for us right now, I think what's really striking to me, I keep thinking about Beth's comment about what to do with all the screenshots. And I've been thinking a lot about, that slide that I had that was the National Museum of American History collecting Hurricane Katrina history, Hurricane Katrina objects. We have the 9/11 Memorial Museum. We have museums that and institutions that are collecting objects that are really representative of these moments of rupture, these kind of transformational events. But the pandemic is kind of a wild moment because we don't have that yet, have that after, and we don't have that moment to say, okay, this is what that moment was, because we're still in it, and we're still in it in a really indeterminate and this language of waves, right? We're in waves, and so if we're all sort of swimming around in the ocean and we've got all our stuff, just these container ships floating around. I'm really curious about how archives, museums, institutions, private individuals, like how we're going to think of this as a period of time based on the kind of stuff that we engaged with and produced from this moment. And I think with something like the 9/11 Memorial Museum, if you look through the objects collected, or the Smithsonian's 9/11 collection, any kind of collection from that event, it's this really concrete, powerful moment. And right now, because we're in the midst of this durational experience, we don't have as many items that are distinctly of that particular moment. Like Beth's sign with the Pokemon cards is actually pretty incredible that the cards haven't been removed, didn't get reused, didn't get repurposed. I'm thinking of Barbara's sign that got, replaced again and again and again behind her for those Zoom calls. So this is going to be a really interesting moment for future scholars of this, right? And I mean, all of us, we're all scholars of the material world, right? But just to think about, how do you understand the evidence of a moment where everything got reused, where everything got repurposed, where we don't even want to look at stuff anymore. I think of clothes I wore at the beginning of the pandemic that I got rid of because I didn't even want to see them because I wore them too many times. So I think this is giving us a really interesting kind of relationship with our stuff. And then just to flip that back, the ongoing question is, how does this stuff help us understand the moment? And so I think for that, one thing that we want to start to look at is, like, how do the objects from this moment give us a sense of a set of shared practices or a set of activities and a set of mechanisms for coping and ways of thinking about how we communicate, what are the big themes, what are the big conflicts that massive amounts of people in Cambridge and elsewhere were facing during this time. And so, we have this problem of collecting material culture from the pandemic, but also I think these objects are going to be really powerful in narrating and helping us understand something that's hard to wrap our brains around because it's going on for so long. Yeah, that's what I did.
Well, thank you so much, Katie. I really appreciate all of your insights, and I was so excited to have this. It was so participatory, and I'm so glad that folks got to really share and engage with you and with one another. And of course, that's always our goal. So, and I just want to thank everybody for being here. Those of you who shared your objects, those of you who listened and appreciated and reflected on other people's objects. I really am grateful for all of you for being here. And don't forget, we are going to be sending out that survey link. We would love to hear what you loved, what you thought we could improve on for next time. We really do read them and take all of your comments to heart. So thank you all again for being here, and we will see you in the new year with our new theme. Stay tuned for lots of exciting programs coming up. So thank you all so much.